Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast, where we ignite the sparks of change and inspire a world free of racism. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting the most cutting-edge anti-racist research and education for the purpose of connecting practitioners to powerful research-based approaches to racial equity. I am your host, Dr. Tracy A. Benson, and today we invite you on a transformative journey as we delve into the efforts and triumphs of those dedicated to fostering racial equity within education. Hello, welcome everyone to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research Practice Podcast. Today we have a wonderful guest, great friend, colleague, someone I really admire as an education leader that I met over 2 years ago when she first applied to join the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute and now has become a full-time person on staff, our first full-time hire. And it's just been a wonderful partnership over time. And I appreciate her coming on the podcast to have a conversation today. So Dr. Crystal Harden-Lindsey, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to the listeners today.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Dr. Benson. It has been a privilege to be on this learning journey with you. I can remember when I first applied, I was looking to do something different in education. I had been a principal for 8 years by that time. Before then, I was a teacher for 11 years, transitioned and was CEO of Green Street Academy, as well as the president of the Maryland Alliance for Public Charter Schools. So at that time, I was really busy, but I had a fire burning in my belly. And you were speaking my language around anti-racism and the work that it takes to move students and really talk with adults about instructional practices. So I got excited and applied, and grateful 2 years later, I am still here with you and still on this learning journey. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And Crystal is now our chief, what's the title? Chief
Program officer.
Program officer. I was like, chief admissions officer? We're not a college. Chief program officer, right?
Yes.
You know, facilitation, coaching, and managing coaches, and everything else that comes under an umbrella of what we have to hold down here at the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute. And so if you're thinking back to the time, because you were among the first 7 coaches that I ever hired. It was just me and my ops team. You know, I was a facilitator, I was the coach, I did all the sort of the clerical work, I did all the traveling, and it expanded so much that I needed folks to support the coaching work. And so when you saw the ad, you were busy yourself with what you were doing. So what intrigued you about it, and why did you choose to join?
The number one thing that I always tell people that intrigue me is the words anti-racism. So I have been working in Baltimore, and we were fixated on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that can span over so many different aspects of life and intersectionality. But as you know, Baltimore is a pretty Black city. And I felt like we were running away from talking about race. So the fact that this particular institute or job opportunity afforded me an opportunity to talk about how race impacts how we educate students, I was really, really excited. In addition to that, I had been a part of different DEI efforts, and I was never really excited about them because it seemed to be the same people talking at you, and you don't really walk away with having to do something that will impact kids. And so when I read the actual job posting, it said must be willing to take action. I'm like, oh, these people want us to do something. This might be pretty awesome. If I'm going to be totally honest in this process, I also wanted to challenge myself to see if I could really speak to what race meant in my space. I was working in a really, I would say, white school. When I say white school, I'm talking about the staff members and the actual founders and owners of the school. And they were white men, 65 and older. And so there were so many opportunities for me to directly speak to aspects of the work that race kind of was at the top of what I saw. And my staff liked to stick to diversity, equity, and inclusion because it felt safe. So I
Yeah, let me
wanted to
pause you there.
challenge myself. Yes, yes,
Yeah, I
yes.
wanted to ask you more about, just like the ins and outs of how that happened. So, as far as my history, I was a black principal of a high school with all the staff, all the teachers, folks who worked there were white. I had two black paras in the special ed department. So I had around 200 adults in the building, and I
Okay.
was the black principal, right?
Wow.
And knowing that I wanted to talk about race, but yet not being able to in terms of my mindset, what was your sort of barrier? So you knew that you served black kids, right? Majority black
Yes.
kids, white staff.
Yes.
What were the barriers to being able to talk openly about race in your building when you were the principal and executive director?
I would say maybe we had about 70 staff members. Of the 70 staff members, the middle school teachers were mostly Black teachers, and the high school teachers were mostly white teachers. And it naturally created a division that looked like it was
Mm,
segregated based on race. So there would be issues that would come up where the Black teachers would be saying, well, the white teacher said this, and the white teacher is saying the Black teachers are saying these things, and they connected it to race. And because we had been deep in this DEI space, they would say, we really need some work on being culturally competent. And I'd be like, what? What does that really mean? Like, what are we really saying? And when it came to addressing race at the board level, because I answered to a board at that time, most of my board members were white older men, and they were well-meaning people, and for the most part, I would say wonderful people. But the connection to race, if you brought anything up that was specifically connected to race, made the room very uncomfortable, almost to the point where you would have silence. And it made me really nervous because I was a net will employee. I knew that my board was they were brought into the DEI model, but when you specifically start talking about race, people get a little nervous. And while Baltimore is a very considered a very black city, the power does not lie with the people of color. Most of the executives, especially in my space, they were white. They were white and they were men in most
hmm
cases. So many
right.
times I would be the only person of color at the table. In some cases, the only woman. So I had three pieces that seemed to work against me sometimes. One was age. I seemed really young compared to the other operators. I was sometimes the only woman compared to who was in the room, and then definitely being a person of color. Last but not least, Dr. Benson, I have to add this in, and I was also a Baltimorean. So, Baltimore is a place where people from the outside come in and they create all these initiatives. And the real question is, do we really want them? Like, do we want
Mm.
these new initiatives? And that was a piece that I believe is connected to race. And so, it was just a really interesting, pivotal point for me where I said, I want to be able to speak to this and not worry about my job if it's going to have an impact on students.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yes, you said a lot in terms of your identity and sort of the environment and the willingness of those who have sort of up in the racial hierarchy, right? White men, in terms of the racial hierarchy, are at a point there where white men wield extreme power over the
Yes.
ability for us to have these conversations because they can have very real impacts on your job and your livelihood
Yes.
if they become, fragile and react poorly. So
Mhm.
you mentioned DEI a couple of times, right? And
Yes.
that DEI wasn't exactly so diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? That's sort of like
Yes.
race-ish. How do we manage not to talk about race if we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? How does that happen?
I this drives me crazy, but I'm going to say it, Dr. Benson. Oftentimes, when we would talk about race, along the way, someone would bring in the LGBT community. And I would say, well, there's a space for intersectionality down the road, but let's stick with the racial component first. And for lots of my teachers, as well as the leaders in the school, that became a place of contention. Well, I don't want anybody to get upset that we're talking about race. Let's talk about all of it because we want people to know that it's all equally important. And I'm like, yes, we have to bite take small chunks and let's start with race since we serve Black children. Like, let's start with that. Not only that, we serve students in the middle of West Baltimore. That is a very different kind of thing because Baltimore is broken up from West Baltimore to East Baltimore. And if you recall the Freddie Gray uprisings in Baltimore, our students were involved in what that uprising looked like. They planned to leave school. I was a principal at the time, and our students were in the midst of that. So we cannot discount race as a factor when we start talking about the different policies that impact how we run our school and also the idea of institutionalized racism. My faculty and some of the leaders in the school failed to see race as a system and wanted to see race as an individual event.
Gotcha. And so they brought in the DEI space. And I want to talk about the sort of I don't even know if it's cost benefit or pros and cons of DEI, right? We specifically do anti-racism, right?
Yes.
In our job, right? To purposefully alleviate the oppression on communities of color, right? To
Yeah.
validate that we're doing that, right? And often in DEI space, it's sort of a nebulous space of what are we doing exactly. So what are some of the activities, initiatives you took on under the umbrella of DEI when you were leading Green Street?
We created an equity team, and the equity team took months just to come up with an equity statement. Just a statement to say, like, this is what we believe should happen for our students. We had book studies. So we would have books. There's a book that everyone reads in Baltimore called Not in My Neighborhood that's all about redlining and how Baltimore is one of the birthplaces for redlining. So we would have book studies and we would do all kinds of activities. We would have speakers come in. We would look at subgroups. We didn't have many subgroups as it correlated with race.
Mm-hmm.
Our subgroups look like special ed, 504, social economic status. So we had subgroups, and they would prefer to just focus on the subgroup. So everybody's Black, so we don't have to think about it. And I'm like, no, we got a couple kids that aren't Black, you know? And so it became easier, I think, to have the conversation about race because you could slide it in and people were quick to slide back out. So it almost is like a spectrum, like, oh, I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but if I don't want to talk about it because someone gets uncomfortable, I can slide back down to um, another aspect of this umbrella of DEI. So in some spaces, I believe it was a cop out for some people not to talk about race. But in other spaces, I do see value in early career people. So I would have early career people who I had a group of teachers that were from the Midwest and talking about DEI or anything like that. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is not a real thing. They're not, they didn't connect in any kind of way to this idea, and they just felt like being a white person or a person who came from a certain background. I am coming into this space because I can make a difference. Not we can make a difference, but I can make a difference. Almost like a savior complex. So DEI was a comfortable space for those people, but when it was time to transition to anti-racism, it became a bigger problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we have to center the conversation around race, right? And DEI
Yes.
is another iteration of sort of keeping us at the surface level where we want to push more towards let's let's just make us better people. Let's have a book study and
Yes.
know more. Let's have a comfortable conversation amongst adults. And it almost seems like, oh, well, actually, in reality, the children are an afterthought. Like there's no thought in terms of how our actions and our beliefs going to actually change and affect student outcomes. And so if you had to go, so now you've been in with the organization for a while, you've coached lots and lots of leaders. Like if
Yes.
you go back to the Dr. Harden-Lindsey first becoming principal of Green Street Academy, in your first 3 years, what would you have done, coached yourself to do differently?
Well, first of all, I would not have. So, as I can remember, as a very early on principal, I would allow my leadership team to make certain decisions because I wanted to create collaboration. I wanted them to feel like we had to come to consensus, and I wouldn't do that. when it comes to anti-racism. I don't really care that you don't want to do this right now and it's not a priority. We serve Black kids. We can see what the numbers are. Another thing that I would have did, taking a step back, my team would have been comprised of different people. So I must admit, Dr. Benson, that my team consisted of all white men for 5 years. So I was the principal. My assistant principals were white men. My deans were both white men. So it was just me and 4 white men. And whenever there was an issue that would come up with race, Dr. Benson, something that I regret that I did was I would step in to save them. So, for example, if something would happen with a parent, let's just say, and the parent is like, yes, because this assistant principal is racist. He made a racist remark, or this teacher did something, and if it had anything to do with race, I automatically stepped in and took it on versus raising their capacity to deal with issues that center around race. So I did not build capacity in that way. I took it on myself because I was the only person of color. So I felt like I had to carry that. And over time, Dr. Benson, it became heavy. So 2 things I would do. The first thing is I would have my leadership team all have a mat. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about race explicitly because you're all white men and you're working with Black kids. Let's talk about it. What could possibly happen? What are some of your thoughts? I would take them through that process and I would have us all make an ITC map. Now it would have been easy for me to coach them because they have individual meetings with me already. But now I'm going to specifically take 30 minutes of this time and talk about your ITC map and what's coming up for you. I would have done that, as well as I would not have shielded them from racial issues. And I did. And I'll tell you one big pitfall. When I wasn't there and I moved on and was no longer in that space, race became a major issue within that school because I wasn't a buffer. So there was no buffer. So I must admit that when I reflect on who I am as a leader and some of the roadblocks that I created or mental blocks I created for myself, was assuming that I had to be the one to deal with racial issues all the time and not building the capacity of my white male leaders.
Yes, yes, it's very poignant sort of a reflection and advice, right? Because often we think we're doing good, that we have the depth of knowledge, we have the racial literacy. These individuals don't know how to handle it, and plus they're really uncomfortable and they'd rather not. And so by stepping forward and maybe being more effective at the time at helping kids and the community of color, we're underdeveloping the capacity of our counterparts who never get the opportunity to step into that uncomfortable space. And you mentioned the ITC process. That's the immunity to change process. Comes from an organization called Minds at Work out of Cambridge. Now we're not going to give away the secret sauce, but we do incorporate that very much so into our model to help individuals tap into their capacity to push forward change and locate the fear that they have to overcome before becoming more effective. And so thinking about your transition from executive director, leading the school, that was your life, that was your career for a very long time, into the role of coach of coaches at this point, but still doing a fair amount of coaching as well. Let's just talk about that experience, right? Because I have stuff to share as well. So, what are some of like your joys you see about doing this work? Well, one, what's the power of coaching, right? Because often folks, especially in the DEI space, they might learn a lot, read a lot, I want to do something, but then go back into their building or schoolhouse and not know what to do. So, let's talk about the power of coaching. Why having an anti-racist leadership coach is so important. Why is it so important in your perspective?
From my perspective, having a coach specifically on the anti-racist arm is extremely important because it reminds everyone that we have all ingested white supremacy. Like we can't run from it. So we've all been a part of systems that have structures that exude racist practices. And I would say 99% of every single person that I've met with will openly say, yes, this system seems unfair. Now, what they're going to do about it, that's a different conversation, Dr. Benson. But the humanistic side of acknowledging that race plays a major part in some of the disparities that we see across our nation, to me, is half the battle. So, getting someone to acknowledge that in a very human way. Also, the power of anti racism coaching is that you can help people along by saying, these are things I've done that help the racism persist. So just because I'm a person of color does not mean that I have not had a hand in the racism, the structures that I've been a part of these systems. There were times where I knew this decision was not a decision that directly benefited kids of color, but I went along with it. So being able to directly say to school leaders that we've all been there, now what, is half the battle. In many cases, people are afraid and almost feel guilty or shameful that they have participated in these systems or structures, or they've been a part of some of that movement. And so I love getting adults to take action to kind of peel back the onion, for lack of a better word, to say like, oh, this and this thing happened, and I also didn't say that. And so what I always tell all my coachees is that while we're going to be using this process, we also want to constantly think about missed opportunities, because there'll be missed opportunities along the way. So how do I hold myself accountable as a school leader, for acknowledging that whatever subgroup or the students of color, how do I hold myself accountable for their academic progress? It's not enough for adults to just take action if we're not measuring it back to student outcomes. So that's the
Right.
work to me. That's the work.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the part of coaching I find most important as well. And I currently have a coach in my profession, even as a consultant, I still have a coach to do the
Yes.
work that I do. So the power of coaching, because as a part of our model, for those who don't know, is that we have the first 10 hours is very intense learning. Right,
Yes.
reading, learning, discussion, building the racial literacy around what it means to lead for anti-racism. And after that, folks come out of the session like really pumped and ready to go and ready to rock and roll. But in most of the cases, when folks go back into the building, they're out of the safe space where we just discussed building the capacity to do the work, and they're isolated in their building with others who haven't gone through the institute. The regression to the mean is often almost instant, like, "Oh, this is scary. We're not here in a safe group learning space. I'm now in my building and I'm alone, and my literacy's up here, but yet, I don't know where others are." And so that part of the coach should come in and say, "Well, remember what you learned. Remember what
Mhm.
we've planned." And so we pair individuals that come out of the learning process with 4.5 months of coaching to get
Yes.
to build a dexterity to actually do the work. And
Mhm.
so, can you talk about some of the joys and challenges of coaching? I want to share as well, but I want you to start. So let's start with some of the joys that you have. You can tell a particular story or just something that you feel that is very powerful in your time during your time as a coach. What are some of the joys of doing this work as a coach?
I think one of the major joys of doing the work is when the work becomes infectious. So, for example, I'm working with a superintendent, let's just say, and our conversations are confidential. So, what we're talking about in terms of their own learning goals and how they're impacting the work, I'm not going to share with maybe the assistant suit that I'm also coaching. But a point of joy is when they say, we all come to the conclusion that this is not working. Can we talk about how we can take some action? What does that look like? I feel like our district is not doing due justice by this group of students. Can we focus specifically on them? That brings me joy, because what it tells me is, just like a cold, infection can be good. So now, you have this robust group of people that want to do something, but they also understand that in order to move their district, they individually have to do the work. And so that is my favorite part, when coachees start taking accountability for student outcomes and they change their language. So the language is no longer, these students aren't making progress. The language becomes, I have not equipped my teachers with what they need in order to move student achievement in a way that's reflective at the for the LCAP scores or for the MSA or whatever that statewide test is that sometimes to keep their jobs superintendents are looking at. And so they change their language where the language is no longer a blame language of blaming students, but it's more about accountability. We need to do something. The adults need to do something, and we are responsible for moving them. And I can think of one person we work with in Massachusetts who she was very flat. And then one day, I don't know what happened or what she drank. But the next day, when I met with her, she was fired up. And she said, I had the ability to influence others, and I have not been doing that. So if I take responsibility for what influence looks like as it relates to this subgroup of students of color, we can see a difference. And I think, and Dr. Benson, you probably have an idea of the group I'm talking about. We
Right.
saw different people at the end where they could openly speak about race. They could openly speak about the missteps of the district, as well as the structures that were in place. And this idea of saying something's wrong with this group of students changed totally, where they were like, well, we never set them up to be successful. Let's start with that. And
Right.
that is what brings me a lot of joy because the adults are taking action.
Absolutely, and it's funny that you brought up that story because I ran into that superintendent of that district,
Okay.
2 days ago. I was at a
Wow.
conference in
Okay.
Massachusetts, a wonderful
Okay.
conference, and I just happened to walk and this is part of the joy, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because when we start out, we have to sort of wrestle through it, the discomfort, the fear, lack
Yes.
of a system, lack of a collective understanding about how we aim directly at student outcomes because we've never done it before. So a lot of confusion, a lot of fear. We have to sort of get through it and get folks to take little baby steps, right? And
Mhm.
sometimes it never feels like we're going to get there,
Yes.
right? But we have to keep going. We have to keep coming back to the table. And I ran into the superintendent, and he just so happened to be explaining our equity audit process to another superintendent. And I just happened
Wow.
to walk up, and he's like, and it's the first time I didn't know he was even going to be there. He's like, oh my gosh, this is what a crazy moment. I was just explaining to them our work with you. I'm like, that's awesome, right? And so that was great in terms of like spreading good work because they had done DEI work, the district that he was talking done DEI work with no traction. And then he
Wow.
turned to me and said, "Well, you'll be very proud of us, because we ended our partnership with them sometime at the end of last school year, and it's
Wow.
November now." He said, we had our second data meeting today around outcomes for our Black students. And I was like, oh, look out now. They had no data systems before. They had
Right.
no way of tracking. They didn't meet. They didn't say we're going to meet specifically about our Black students. That was not
Okay.
a part of their lexicon or system. And he told me all about it, right? Very forthright, very proud. And, I was like, you have a proud papa moment. I'm not your papa, but, I'm like, we worked through it. We did. Yay.
Yes.
Hercules, Hercules. I was so happy that they had taken it and become a part of their culture. And that is the
Mm,
joy, of coaching. So let's talk
yes.
about some of the challenges. Like what are
Wow.
some of the challenges? Because we carry a lot, in this work. And, just coach, some people, oh, you're just a coach. You talk with folks for an hour every other week. It can't be that much. But there are challenges here. There are real challenges. And we put our heart and soul into changes on behalf of kids. So what are some of the challenges that you've experienced?
I'll start by saying one of the biggest challenges to me is people who say they don't see race. That that is a big challenge because the truth of it is that what I'll have them do is say, well, describe me.
Mm,
They're gonna eventually say black. And so, I say to them, do you think that while the fact that I'm black may not have an impact on you, right? But would you agree that someone might see me and say, oh, this is a black woman and have some thoughts? And you'll still have people that say, no, no, I haven't experienced something like that. Another piece that's really challenging, and I have this one and another one. The next piece that's really challenging is that we have to be okay with understanding that some people are okay with racist structures.
mhm.
And we want to work to get them to change their mindsets. And some people will come in and say, I am doing this work because Dr. Benson said I had to, but our structures are not racist. And I am a good person. So this good bad binary racist is you know is definitely counterproductive to our work, assuming that race is just an individual person or individual event, not looking at the higher order institutional racism that impacts housing and education and healthcare disparities. And so getting someone to the other side to help them to see that sometimes is a challenge, and it takes longer than you would like, because by the time you get them to the other side, some of your time is up. And you take so long to get there, and their mindset and their mental blocks won't allow them to get to the place where they're looking at structures directly for students and how they can change practice. So that is tough. Last but not least, I would say personally, the biggest challenge for me is people who have been negatively impacted by the structure and also working in the same way to change the structure. So, what I mean by that is most times people of color who are working in white spaces, to because we need a seat at the table. That's the best way to make change, but become tired of carrying that burden of always being the person of color that has to speak up. That is a challenge because, in order to do the work, you have to be resistant. You have to be, you have to be resilient. And so, because you need to be resilient to do the work, oftentimes you'll meet people of color that really want to see change, like they are dedicated to change. But because they've experienced so many roadblocks and so many demotions and so many reprimands about speaking up, that it becomes a burden for them. And so, I think that is like one of the biggest challenges, carrying that burden while being impacted by the system you're working to correct. That is tough and heavy work.
Right, and we absorb that by proxy, right? Like a lot of
Yes.
the leaders of color we talked to have been in the fight for, years, if not decades, and have been on the receiving end of very explicit sort of professional racism or structural racism, and where they've been targeted because they were doing this work. And so to absorb that as a coach and still try to inspire folks to move forward despite in a different
Yes.
way, it's tough, And the challenge for me as well is that I absorb all of the emotions, the feelings, the passions
Yes.
of my leaders, regardless of their color, who push the work forward. And I care deeply about their success and
Mhm.
also understand that it is psychologically heavy, regardless of
Yes.
who you are as a leader to lead the work, regardless of color. I coach a lot of white men, a lot of white women, a lot of people of color, Black women, Latina women. And people come at it with their own identity, and the
Yes.
struggles are different, right, in
Yes.
terms of the fears and the real worries around it. And absorbing that as a coach and caring so much is that I have to hold that we have a leader who's experiencing the stress, but at the same time, these kids are under oppression, and it's also your responsibility to do it, right? So playing that balance, towing that line and having that balance where we're not pushing too hard, but hard enough that they can make change for kids. That's the
Absolutely.
challenge. So let's talk about some traps and barriers just for the listeners who want to engage in this work, maybe haven't been with us, but just some advice about. I got 3 traps and barriers, so I want you to describe. So I'm going to shoot it at you. We haven't talked about this previously
Okay, here we
about a
go.
barrier, right?
Okay.
And I want to sort of talk through the antidote, right?
Okay.
So because we experience this all the time when it comes to folks who come to this work, they come to us in whatever way. We try to do some unlearning to then learn a more effective way. So one trap we have that we see all the time is relying solely on technical solutions, right?
Wow.
And it comes from the book from Ron Heifetz, Adaptive Leadership, Technical Solutions. And so, if you could explain, what a technical solution is and why that is such a barrier when folks just want to rely on that technical solution.
Sure. So I'm thinking of a specific example that I'm working through now with a coachee, where we are working in a school that has a subgroup of English language learners who are not making progress at the rate that the district would like to see. There's an opportunity gap between the EL students and their white peers, right? And instead, a technical solution that the school leader came up with was like, oh, well, everyone who's in the lowest class gets this intervention. So I'm like, oh, everyone gets it? Yeah, because we don't have a data cycle at all. So if we just track them, it'll be okay. And so I said, well, how long have you been a school leader there? Let's say the person says 5 years. So have this group of students made any progress in 5 years? And let's say the answer to that is no. What is the adaptive challenge why we haven't figured out that we need to move these students? Oftentimes, as I'm thinking of this particular group in particular, it's because 87% of the school is making great progress. So the 13% doesn't seem as relevant for that school leader. That is an adaptive challenge. That is a mindset issue. So we talk through, like, is it that we're forgetting some kids? Is it that some kids' education is more valuable than other? Like, what are we like? What are we really saying to kids if we've been in that school? And for that particular example, it's a 3-year gap, right? But we know that 3 years is a long time to not make significant progress and to not be on level and there to be no interventions in place. So the technical solution is let's just work with the lowest class. Even though in the lowest class, when I say lowest, I mean lowest performing class, everyone in that class, oh, you're going to love this, is not low academically performing. Some of them have behaviors. So anyone that doesn't fit your mold goes into this class. Let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
That is an adaptive issue
Mm-hmm.
because your structure is set up that way. And these are the practices that are in place within your institution that you lead. What does that say about you as a leader? That is the adaptive challenge that nobody wants to look at. So I always tell them it forces you to pick that mirror up and really look in the mirror, because it doesn't matter what you say to me. All it matters is your actions. Your actions will tell me what kind of leader you are. So if you put all of these particular students in this class, whether they're lower performing academically or not, they just don't fit into this mold of your 87%. What does that really say
Mm-hmm.
about what's happening at your school? That is the adaptive side.
Right, right, absolutely. And we see this a lot. Let's just make a class,
Yeah,
a holding space for these kids, right? Let's put them in this class as a technical meaning, like we're just going to
yeah,
do something and put someone somewhere with not a lot of thought around, all right, what's the structure?
yes,
How's this going to affect their other academics in the other classes? Why are they not performing in the first place? We're not going down the rabbit hole to look at their trajectory say they're in seventh grade, in sixth grade, fifth grade, fourth grade. Where do we fail them to the fact that they're not proficient, right? Looking back in the history, to locate points, maybe it's a particular classroom, maybe it's a particular
hmm,
curriculum, who knows what it is, but there's often a point in time where a student starts to not
that's right.
perform very well in school. And the adaptive question is, what during this pipeline process, where did we
Yes,
fail them? Right, so it can be appropriate in terms of making solutions within the mainstream education classroom, right? Because this is only one class here for probably one period, and that people often expect, mainstream teachers expect this period to fix these kids and then come back and be
hmm,
model students. And so the adaptive question is first, like, as you say, why is it okay
yes,
with us? Why is it not a five alarm fire? Why is not everyone concerned? Why is it not a conversation at every PLC about why these students are failing and everyone looking into what we need to do collectively to make sure these kids who are identifiable by
yes,
race and language are constantly failing in our schools? And then how do we create a structure within the mainstream so we don't continue to fail these kids? Because if we don't fix the structure, at the very end, we'll always have the opportunity to make this class over here because that's
yes,
reactive instead of being proactive. So the antidote is being more proactive and having the adaptive conversation around is
yes,
this okay? Because it's not, but according to our actions,
yes.
it is. So another barrier that we see, yeah, this is one that we see in a lot of school districts, is a lack of granular understanding of the racial equity issue. So no data infrastructure, no data analysis. I think and I feel this is a problem, and let's implement a solution. So can you describe that barrier that we see more often than not?
I think in many cases, Dr. Benson, and this is probably a very unpopular opinion. So let me say that before I open up my mouth, right? Um, I think that in many cases, school leaders don't want to know. I can't fix what I don't know. So the reason that there's no real data structure in place is because I can guess what I believe is happening. And that model has continued to oppress certain groups of students. So I'm not even going to go in, and I'll give the classic example of this is I'm going to give the newest teacher the lowest academically performing students. And I know she's brand new or he's brand new, and he doesn't really know what he's doing. So he can't do any harm. I'm not going to give them the highest academically performing students. So we know in our brains that there's a disconnect because we intentionally, and this is a common practice, Dr. Benson, where that new teacher is going to get these students who are the lowest performing students, even though they are not strong in their pedagogy. They are coming from working at Walmart, let's just say, or they're 20 years old and fresh out of college. I'm going to give you these students who I already know are 2 to 3 years behind. And so just questioning, as especially as school leaders, the why becomes offensive. So you're really going to ask me, how come I make this decision? Or you're really going to ask me about the data? And so oftentimes they don't have data structures in place because they really don't want to know. They prefer to pretend not to know. But it is very evident in their actions that they have an idea of what's going on and this idea of loss. So I talk to so many school leaders, and I do understand that we're at a different place after COVID. I know that there's a national teacher shortage. I understand that. But they will make decisions that are best for adults, not even considering students. So, because you are an amazing teacher, Dr. Benson, I'm going to give you the highest performing students because I don't want to lose you and I don't want you to be upset. Instead of switching that to say, I'm going to give you, because you are such an amazing teacher, I'm going to give you our lowest performing students because I trust you to move the needle with them. So it's this idea of they don't trust, there's a lack of trust across systems, but it starts with the school leader. And you know about it because it's linked to their actions and their lack of data this is another piece to talk about, Dr. Benson. They have the data and they don't want to show it to anyone. Or I'm thinking of a group that we were talking about maybe a couple of years ago, a couple of weeks ago, and they're like, well, who's going to get this data? Well, who owns the data? Well, what are you going to do with the data? And it's kind of like, no. Are you using the data to inform instruction? Do you have this data? And I think, that has become, I would say, just the way in which people operate in order to hide their deficiencies, adult deficiencies.
Yeah. Yeah. Right, right. And also, I think there's also a sincere lack of know-how. Because I remember in my master's program, we didn't have a single
No.
class on data analysis, right? Even in my doctoral
Hmm.
program, a single class, undergrad, a single class on how to be a data-driven and data-informed. We knew the language when we were leaders, like, oh yeah, I make data-driven decisions. I can look
Hmm.
at data and describe it, right? We
Hmm.
know all the talk, but when you look under the rug or behind the curtain, you see that most folks they have a genuine
Hmm.
lack of ability to look at granular data, collect it, and use it to inform instruction, inform school practices. And so the antidote is to spend some time, right, and admit that if there's no
That's
capacity,
right.
there is no capacity, and reach
That's
out
right.
for support, and be honest and have the humility. Say we're making I think and I
Yes.
feel decisions. And I believe decisions based on opinion and what people think, not on
That's right.
anything that is real. And this especially happens a lot when it comes to uses of
Mm,
exclusionary discipline. Folks sort of know they suspending black and brown kids a lot, but we
that's
don't know
right.
exactly what's
That's
happening.
right.
You know, but when you crunch the data, and often what we find is when we crunch the data, we'll discover that it's probably 20 to 25% of the teachers in the building that are writing
Yes.
70% of the referrals. And that gives us then a focus, right? Not to be punitive with the instructors, but to offer the teachers
Yes.
tier two support around how do you form a classroom management plans that you're not relying on writing referrals every day for the same
Absolutely.
kids, right? But as you say, once we have the data and then we can focus in on where we need to do our interventions, then it
Yes.
becomes real. And so I could see why a leader wouldn't want to know because then you're
Yes.
accountable for then making things better because you know the data in the improvement cycle. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, and I think you remember the article that I think we read it during the institute when you were training, the
Oh,
performative
Lord.
anti-racism. And this is often where people
Mhm.
come
Mhm.
into the institute having a history of performative anti-racism as their
Yes.
DEI work. So could you talk a little bit about that that barrier
The
trap.
performative anti-racism work forces adults to believe if adults do more things or engage in more activities, then hopefully it'll have an impact on students. There's no measurement, there's no line from the actions to student outcomes. For lack of better words, I have someone I'm working with that I always say there's no straight line from performance or perfection to success. And so this idea, the more that I do things, the hope is that um, things will become better for our students. And so instead of looking at racism as a social construct and looking at it as a space where there's history behind it, it was created for Black and Brown students not to be successful. We don't want to look at it from that way. I just want to do something. I want to do something right now too. So if you're talking to me about race, I don't have time to digest it or even look at my own ways that I've been complicit in the system. I just want to do something. So let's do the book study. Yes. Let's find a presenter, bring them in so that my teachers can check off this box to say that they've heard this perspective. A new wave that I'm seeing, Dr. Benson, is these affinity groups. So let's create a Black
Mm,
affinity group. We're going to bring all of the Black people together, and we have no plan for how we're going to support when they talk about the trauma or when they talk about their experiences. But we will be able to check off a box and say, we created a safe space for you. But was it really safe? Or was it another example of performative anti-racist practices? Another big thing that some schools are doing is these focus groups for students. Not doing anything with the groups. I'm meeting with someone right now who told me, yes, we had a focus group. I said, who ran the focus group? Oh, a consultant. So then they just left. Yes, they're going to send me the notes, in the next few weeks. So you know that it is November. Let's start with that. So we are just thinking about what we're doing in November. And then by Christmas, they'll send you the notes. And then you're going to bring it back to your team. These are all things just to say that you're doing something, but has no direct impact on student outcomes. And actually, I told the person it's actually harmful because what you're doing is you're pulling students from their social setting to do something that adults want them to do without even having the dignity or the humanistic side of you as a leader to sit in to say that it's important or to say we're going to do something with this. And so what you're saying to people of color when you do that is I don't really care about this, but I did something. My time is better spent somewhere else. And that is hurtful.
mhm.
That can be really harmful and hurtful. So we have to be careful because that performative anti-racist, those practices can really hurt kids in long term.
Right, right. It's a form of gaslighting, you know?
Yes.
Let's say that we're committed to it. We're going to do something. Let's have a book study, right? We're
Yes.
committed to it. Let's do something. Let's have an affinity group or student focus group, right? To as a
Yeah.
foray to say we care, but there's no plan for in terms of how it's actually going to impact students, right?
That's right.
And the antidote to that is to start with the problem first. Like, what problem are we seeking to solve first,
Yes.
right? It's just like
Yes.
mapping or understanding by design, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that we start with the problem first. What is the problem in terms of student outcomes that we're trying to address? Is it, the campus racial climate? Do students not feel welcome in the building? Are there racial slurs? Are they being ostracized? Is it student performance, gaps in outcome, academic outcomes? Is it overrepresentation in special education? These are all very real phenomena that exist in school district. And we start with that first and then say, all right, so how do we track back to and use the data in terms of understanding why the phenomenon exists? Then to say,
Yes.
how are we going to intervene in a very specific way to then change the adult practice to then
Yes.
impact the outcomes. Then comes the professional development to change the
Yeah.
adult actions to then reach
That's right.
results. But school districts often in schools end up in this performative space because go right to action. All right, we feel bad that we want to do something, right to action, and then after the action's done, what were we supposed to do with that again? Oh, no one
Right.
remembers, right? Because there's no connection to student outcomes. So the antidote is to start with the problem first. So the last thing I want to ask you about is just advice, right? Because in this work, you've been in with us, you've been in education for a long, long time, and we've been together in the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute for together for over 2 years. And so, what advice do you have for leaders outside of like? Come to the shop, right? If you're experiencing frustration and you're not making movement, come on in, y'all. We're here. But outside of that, what advice would you have for folks listening to this podcast who haven't had the opportunity to work with us to really enhance their capacity to lead for racial equity?
I would say first, the first piece of advice I would have for them, of course, is come to Institute. We will hook you up. But if you, for whatever reason, you're not in a space, it's November, you're not in a space to come to Institute right now, what can I do tomorrow that will have an impact on my students? The first thing I would say is look at your data. And I would say look at data in three buckets, Dr. Benson. I would say should look at attendance, behavior or discipline, however you describe that, and academics to see where students are and if there are, in fact, gaps. So instead of guessing what your school needs or guessing where students are making progress or not, sitting down and really, really looking at where you are academically, behaviorally, and attendance, and seeing how one could impact the other. That is what that, and that's going to take time. But you have to be okay with it, at least knowing the data. Sometimes, Dr. Benson, when we've worked with different organizations, something that has come up that I always go back to that you probably taught me maybe my first 2 to 3 months is sometimes it's somebody in the district that already has this information. Did you ask them? And I know that sounds very like surface level, but in many cases, we've been working with some districts that are very well resourced. There's already someone who has the data. Have you gone about asking for it? At a very low level, right? And so that is the one thing. And then the second thing that I would say any school leader needs to wrestle with is, are you committed to looking at the work? Because if you are not committed, you are gaslighting and just going around your school creating more havoc. And who wants to work with a leader that just creates a lot of havoc? You need to decide that you really want to lead for anti-racism and understand that it is not going to be easy. So some days will be amazing and some days will not be. But are you truly committed to the work? Those are the two pieces. So your data piece, do you just have somebody that already does that? Let's start with that. If not, can you get your data pieces so that you can, at least before you even give it, and this is something that is happening with a couple of our leaders now. They have given the data to other people, but they don't know the data. As the leader, you need to know the data. And then are you committed? Those are the two pieces.
There we go.
Um,
Dr.
yeah,
Harden
that's it.
Lindsay, this has been wonderful. Yeah, so leave with that. Two things: look at your attendance, look at your conduct, look at your achievement
Academics.
data, right? The three legs of
Yeah.
the stool. Look at your academic data. Know it. Know what's going on in your school building. Take a step back. You're at the table, try to make decisions. You don't know your data. Put the brakes on. And let's spend
Yes.
this time that we're meeting looking at our data and understanding what is happening in our building. And then secondly is checking our commitment, right? And
Yes.
commitment to actual progress rather than performance,
Yes.
right?
That's
And
right.
if we're having waivers in our commitment and we really don't have the wherewithal and dexterity, find someone to support you and sort of building your wherewithal to be committed. Dr. Harden-Lindsey, this has been wonderful having this conversation with you. We talk all the time. We meet every week, right? But we're
Yes.
having this conversation in front of y'all just to get into our heads about our time in this work. And it's been a pleasure, and I appreciate you. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. Can't wait to come back or hear some other sessions.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast. Remember, the fight against racism starts with each and every one of us. Together, we can create inclusive environments in our schools that celebrate diversity and empower all students. For more information, visit our website at antiracisminstitute.com and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time as we continue to shine a light on the champions of change. Stay inspired, committed, and let's make a difference together.